All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep, really deep, into the mind of, well, a pretty fascinating guy, Søren Kierkegaard.
Yeah, he's quite a figure.
19th century Danish thinker. I mean, this is a guy born in 1813, died in 1855. And, he was really laying the groundwork for what we know today as existentialism.
Yeah,
Like way before it became, a major philosophical movement, he was already wrestling with some pretty big questions about what it means to be human, what it means to exist.
absolutely. And he was asking these questions in a way that really resonated with people later on.
And he still resonates with us, right? That's why we're talking about him today.
For sure.
So in this deep dive, we have quite a bit to cover. We've got excerpts from his major works. We've got diaries, letters spanning his entire career, which is amazing.
It is. It's a rich body of work.
And the goal here is to kind of, extract the essence of Kierkegaard's thought, right?
Like, what are the core insights?
Yeah, the core insights, the things that will make you go, aha.
Those light bulb moments.
Yeah, exactly, the light bulb moments, regardless of, whether you've got a PhD in philosophy or you're just starting to explore these ideas for the first time.
It's about those fundamental questions we all grapple with.
Totally. And speaking of fundamental questions, there's this quote from Kierkegaard that really just grabbed me right from the start. It's in Portuguese, actually. Debemos comprender que há coisas que nunca entenderemos, which means we must understand that there are things we will never understand.
Wow.
I mean, that's a pretty powerful statement, right? It's almost like a paradox to understand that there are limits to our understanding.
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to start because that's really at the heart of what Kierkegaard was all about. It's about acknowledging that human reason has its boundaries, especially when we're trying to grasp the big mysteries of existence. Faith, meaning, purpose, all those huge questions.
Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. One of the things that really struck me as I was going through these texts is how Kierkegaard was already grappling with these ideas of, like, nothingness, anxiety, dread, these existential themes, right?
Absolutely.
And he was doing this decades before thinkers like Heidegger and Sartre, who are, the big names that we associate with existentialism.
He was way ahead of his time in that sense. You could almost say that he was like a proto-existentialist.
I like that, proto-existentialist. Yeah, I mean, Heidegger's Being and Time, that comes out in 1927, right?
Right.
And Sartre's Being and Nothingness, 1945. So Kierkegaard is already exploring these themes like a century earlier.
And in a really profound way. It's not just that he touches on these ideas, he really delves into them
Yeah,
with this incredible depth and intensity.
totally. And it's almost like Sartre's idea of humanity as a useless passion, this striving for meaning in a universe that may be inherently meaningless. It's like a direct echo of Kierkegaard's own explorations of despair and our struggle to find some kind of solid ground in this uncertain world.
You're right, there's a clear connection there. I mean, think about it. Sartre is talking about this feeling of like being thrown into existence without any clear purpose or direction, right? And Kierkegaard was wrestling with those same feelings, this sense of being lost, of searching for something that might not even be there.
Yeah, this idea that we're constantly reaching for something beyond ourselves, but we don't even know what that something is.
Exactly. And maybe, as Kierkegaard suggests, the point isn't to find a definitive answer, but to learn to live with the questions.
Okay, so all of this heavy stuff, these deep philosophical ideas, we can't forget that this wasn't just abstract thinking for Kierkegaard, right? I mean, his own life was,
Yeah.
well, pretty dramatic, you could say.
Oh, yeah. Tumultuous, I think, is the word that comes to mind.
Tumultuous, yeah, that's a good one. And it feels like that personal turmoil really infused his philosophy,
Yeah.
right? Like you can't really separate the two. You absolutely can't. His life and his thought are so intertwined. He even described his own upbringing with his wealthy but often quite melancholy father as insane. I mean, that's a pretty strong word to use.
It is. And it makes you wonder, like, what was going on in that household?
Right. What kind of environment was that to grow up in?
Yeah. What were the dynamics?
And how did that shape his worldview?
Exactly. And then, there's the fact that he initially studied theology, which, I mean, you can't help but think that that was maybe influenced by his father,
Like
right?
trying to please him, follow in his footsteps or something.
Right, like trying to live up to some expectation. But then he abandons theology, goes through this period where he's kind of living it up, almost like a bon vivant, right?
Indulging in the pleasures of the world, yeah.
Exactly. But then his father dies, and it's like this huge turning point. And he goes back to his studies, but this time it's philosophy.
Like he needed that space, that distance, to really find his own path. Totally. And then, of course, there's the broken engagement, which, I mean, that's like the classic Kierkegaard's story, right?
Oh yeah, that's one of the most well-known events of his life. It had a huge impact on it.
It's like a defining moment, And the
Yeah,
anguish, the heartbreak, it's all there in his writing.
absolutely. And that intense emotional experience, that's what fueled some of his most powerful and influential works. I mean, think about either Fear and Trembling and Repetition, all published in 1843. These books are grappling with these really big themes, right? Choice, faith, the complexities of human relationships, and they're all seen through this lens of personal struggle, of intense pain.
Yeah, it's like he's taking his own personal experience and using it to explore these universal human questions.
Exactly. And Fear and Trembling, that's a really good example of this. He's exploring the story of Abraham, who's commanded by God to sacrifice his son, Isaac.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
It's a really challenging story. And Kierkegaard is drawing a parallel between Abraham's agonizing choice and his own experience with his broken engagement.
Right, like both of them facing these impossible decisions.
Exactly. Decisions that can't really be explained or justified by reason alone.
So after those works in 1843, he didn't exactly slow down, right? I mean, he kept publishing like a pretty significant body of work throughout his life.
No, he was incredibly prolific. Like Philosophical Fragments and The Concept of Anxiety both came out in 1844. And then in 45, we have Stages on Life's Way and Concluding Unscientific Postscript in 46.
Wow. And he was only, what, in his early 30s at this point?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
And even after his death, there were more works published posthumously, like The Sickness Unto Death in 49 and Practice in Christianity in 1850. And his influence, it hasn't faded.
No, not at all. Okay, so there's one thing about Kierkegaard that I've always found really fascinating and a little bit strange, to be honest.
That's
His use of pseudonyms.
yeah, that's definitely one of his most distinctive features.
It wasn't just like a pen name here or there, it was like a whole cast of characters. He had all these different authors for his books.
Mhm. And each pseudonym had their own distinct voice and perspective.
So what was that all about? Was he just trying to be like mysterious or something?
I think it was much more than that. He called it indirect communication. And the idea was that by using these pseudonyms, he could avoid presenting himself as some kind of authority figure.
So he didn't want people to just take his word for it.
Exactly. He wanted readers to engage with the ideas themselves, to wrestle with them, and ultimately to arrive at their own subjective truth.
So it was more about prompting thought than dictating answers.
Exactly. It's about encouraging the reader to become an active participant in the philosophical process, rather than just a passive recipient of information.
I mean, that's pretty revolutionary, isn't it? Like to create this whole literary strategy to force people to think for themselves.
I think so. And it speaks to his deep respect for individual subjectivity. I mean, he didn't want to impose his own views on anyone. He wanted you to discover your own truth, your own way of being in the world.
Okay, so that brings us to this idea of subjectivity, right? And Kierkegaard is often called the philosopher of subjectivity.
And for good reason.
Mhm.
He placed enormous emphasis on the individual's unique experience. That's where he believed truth resided, not in some objective external reality.
So it wasn't about finding some universal truth that applies to everyone.
Not exactly. For Kierkegaard, truth was something that was personally embraced and lived out authentically.
So it's more about how you live your life, the choices you make, the way you engage with the world.
Yes, it's about creating yourself, forging your own path, rather than conforming to some predetermined mold.
So how does this idea of despair fit into all of this? Because he talks a lot about despair, especially in The Sickness Unto Death. And, it's not just like feeling sad or down.
No, it's much deeper than that. He describes despair as this fundamental disconnect from oneself. It's like a failure to be fully conscious of who you are and the possibilities for freedom that you have.
So it's almost like being alienated from your own existence.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're not fully inhabiting your own life. You're not truly present to yourself.
And that can manifest in different ways, right?
Oh, absolutely. In The Sickness Unto Death, he talks about these three forms of despair. There's the despair of not even being aware that you have a self. Then there's the despair of not wanting to be who you are, like you're rejecting your own being. And then finally, there's the despair of wanting to be someone else, like you're constantly striving to be something that you're not.
And all of these forms of despair point to this fundamental lack of self-acceptance.
Exactly. And for Kierkegaard, this lack of self-acceptance is a major obstacle to living a truly authentic and meaningful life.
Okay, so now we have to talk about the leap of faith.
The infamous leap of faith.
It's one of his most well-known ideas, but also one of the most misunderstood, I think.
Yeah, people often misinterpret it. It's not about blindly believing something without any reason or evidence.
So what is it about?
It's about recognizing that there are certain truths, especially religious truths, that are beyond the grasp of reason. They can't be proven or disproven through logic.
So it's not about abandoning reason altogether.
No, it's about recognizing its limitations. Like, reason can take us a certain distance, but at some point, we have to make a leap. We have to trust in something beyond our rational understanding.
And he uses the story of Abraham as an example of this, right?
Exactly. Abraham is commanded by God to sacrifice his son, Isaac. And, I mean, that's a pretty wild command, right?
Yeah, it's hard to wrap your head around that one.
And for Kierkegaard, this story is all about the nature of faith. It's about a radical trust in God that goes beyond any kind of rational justification.
So it's not about understanding why God would ask such a thing.
No, it's about trusting in God's will, even when it seems completely absurd or even morally wrong.
Okay, so this whole idea of the leap of faith, it seems like it's a direct challenge to the more rationalist philosophies of his time, right? Especially someone like Hegel.
Oh, absolutely. Kierkegaard was very critical of Hegel's system of pure reason, which aimed to achieve this kind of all-encompassing objective understanding of reality.
It's like Hegel was trying to create this grand, unified system of knowledge that could explain everything.
Yeah, like a giant puzzle where all the pieces fit together perfectly.
Yeah.
And Kierkegaard was like, no, that's not how life works. There are always going to be pieces missing. There are always going to be mysteries.
And he argued that human understanding is always situated within this individual perspective, right? You can't escape your own subjectivity.
Exactly. Your understanding of the world is always shaped by your own experiences, your own body, your own consciousness.
So even if you try to be objective, you're still bringing all of your own baggage with you.
And that's not a bad thing, according to Kierkegaard. It's just part of being human. It's what makes each of us unique.
Okay, so this rejection of objectivity, it had a pretty significant impact on later thinkers, right?
Huge impact. I mean, 20th century French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, his work on the phenomenology of perception, deeply influenced by Kierkegaard's critique of Hegelian objectivity. And then, of course, there's Kierkegaard's influence on Protestant theology. I mean, that's huge. He's still being read and debated by theologians today. Thinkers like Martin Buber, Rudolf Bultmann, Paul Tillich, they were all grappling with the implications of Kierkegaard's ideas.
It's like he planted these seeds that just kept growing and spreading. Okay, so let's try to pull all of this together.
Very.
What are some of the key insights, the most thought-provoking statements from Kierkegaard that are really relevant for us today, for people who are trying to, like, gain knowledge quickly, but also deeply?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are so many to choose from, but here are a few that really stand out to me. There's this diary entry from 1835 that I just love. He writes, "What I really need is to have clarity about what I must do, not what I must know." I think that's so powerful because it gets to the heart of what really matters in life. It's not just about accumulating knowledge. It's about figuring out how to live, what actions to take.
It's about finding your purpose.
Exactly. And then there's this other quote, which is even more famous. Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. It's from his diaries in 1843, and it speaks to this tension between understanding and action. Like,
Yeah.
we can look back on our lives and try to make sense of them, but when we're actually living, we have to move forward into the unknown,
We can't wait for all the answers before we take a step.
right? We have to act even when we're not sure what the outcome will be.
And that's where faith comes in, right?
Yeah, and remember, faith for Kierkegaard isn't about blind belief. It's about trust. It's about taking that leap into the unknown. And he has this great quote about that, too. He says, "It is the duty of human understanding to understand that there are things which it cannot understand."
Which takes us back to the beginning, right?
This little circle.
Understanding the limits of our understanding.
And maybe even finding some peace in that uncertainty.
Okay, and we have to talk about anxiety.
Oh, yeah, a key theme for Kierkegaard.
And he doesn't see anxiety as just a negative emotion, does he?
No, he sees it as an inherent part of the human condition. He calls it the dizziness of freedom, which is such a great image.
It's like when you realize how many choices you have, how many possibilities are open to you, it can be almost overwhelming. It can make you feel dizzy.
And that's what anxiety is, according to Kierkegaard.
Yeah.
It's the feeling that arises when you contemplate your own freedom, your own potential.
So it's not something to be afraid of?
Not necessarily. It's something to be reckoned with. It's part of what it means to be a self-conscious being.
Okay, so there's another quote from Kierkegaard that I always think about, and it's from Either Or. He says, The thoughts of men are thin and fragile as lace.
Ouch.
I know, right? This is a pretty harsh critique of his time. He was basically saying that people weren't really engaging with life in a passionate, meaningful way.
He felt like there was a lack of depth, a lack of substance in the intellectual climate of his era. And he contrasted this with the passionate figures of the Old Testament, with the heroes of Shakespeare.
And it makes you wonder, like, is that still true today? Are we still too focused on superficial things?
It's a question worth asking, for sure.
And then there's that quote about marriage, which is like kind of a downer, but it's also kind of funny.
Oh, yeah, the one about regret.
Yeah, he says, marry and you will regret it. Don't marry, you will also regret it.
He's being provocative,
Right.
obviously, but there's also some truth to it, right? Like any major life decision is going to have its ups and downs.
There's no guarantee of happiness no matter what you choose.
And that's part of what it means to be free. You have to make choices, knowing that you might regret them later.
Okay, one more quote I want to touch on, and it's this idea that understanding oneself in existence is the Christian principle.
Yeah, that's from Concluding Unscientific Postscript. And it really highlights how much emphasis Kierkegaard placed on subjective experience.
It's not about blind obedience to dogma.
No, it's about understanding your own relationship to faith. It's about living your beliefs in a way that's authentic to you.
And one last thing that really struck me was this image that Kierkegaard used later in his life. He compares himself to a passenger on a ship who sees a storm approaching but can't do anything to stop it.
Oh yeah, that's a powerful one. It was in 1854, and he was reflecting on what he saw is the decline of true Christianity. Like he felt like he had these insights, but he couldn't change the course of events.
It's like he had this sense of foreboding, but he was powerless to act.
Yeah, a bit of a Cassandra figure, seeing the truth but not being able to convince others.
And then finally, there's this whole exploration of the difference between a genius and an apostle.
That's a fascinating distinction that he makes. Like, the genius operates within the realm of human intellect and creativity, right? But the apostle is divinely authorized. They're operating on a whole other level.
It's about the source of their authority.
Exactly. And for Kierkegaard, ultimately, religious authority comes from God, not from human achievement.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
But what are the key takeaways? Like, if someone's listening to this deep dive, what are the big things they should remember about Kierkegaard?
Okay, well, first and foremost, I think it's this emphasis on subjective truth. That's like his central idea. Truth isn't something out there waiting to be discovered. It's something that's created through your own individual experience.
Yeah, it's about how you live your life, the choices you make.
Exactly. And then there's this acceptance of paradox, this idea that life is full of contradictions and mysteries that we may never fully understand.
Which ties back to that initial quote, right?
Exactly. We must understand that there are things we will never understand.
And that's okay.
More than okay. It's actually essential. Because when we embrace the limits of our understanding, it opens us up to the possibility of faith. And remember, faith for Kierkegaard is about taking that leap. It's about trusting in something beyond ourselves, even when it doesn't make sense.
And it's also about accepting that anxiety, despair, these are not just negative emotions, they're part of the human experience.
Yeah, they're part of what it means to be free, to have choices.
So to wrap this all up, you know, in a world that's constantly pushing us to find certainty, to have all the answers, maybe the real key is to learn to embrace the unknown, to be comfortable with not knowing.
Yeah, to find some peace in the mystery.
Yeah.
And maybe that's where we find true freedom.
So here's something for you to think about. In a world that often demands certainty, how might embracing the limits of your understanding actually empower you? How might Kierkegaard's ideas about subjective truth and the acceptance of the unknown help you find your own path, your own meaning in life?
It's a question worth pondering. And if you're intrigued by what we've talked about today, I highly encourage you to explore Kierkegaard's works for yourself. You might be surprised by how relevant, how challenging, and how ultimately, how life-affirming his ideas can be.
And that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.